Let me ask you a question. Who do you think of when talking about the most famously skilled players in history? For many, I have no doubt that the image of Ronaldinho with his Brazilian flair, dancing and gliding effortlessly over defenders is what comes to many of your minds. But what if I told you there was an African Ronaldinho that had equally insane skills and would embarrass even the greatest defenders and goalkeepers of his generation? But to call him that isn't even right. Because, in fact, he was doing all these incredible displays of skill before Ronaldinho would even make a name for himself. The player who, believe it or not, taught Ronaldinho skills and tricks as a senior and a mentor when they were on the same squad. Because while the younger generation might look at Jay Jay Okocha as the African Ronaldinho, the older fans will know that it was indeed Ronaldinho who was known as the Brazilian Jay Jay Okocha. But the story of how Jay Jay Okocha became known in the footballing world is quite different from the path of many typical footballers who are recognized as prodigies from a very young age. Because Jay Jay Okocha was someone who was never really a highly scouted prospect as a young player. In fact, he was never even scouted at all. His footballing story and journey is incredibly unconventional. Born in Nigeria in the early 70s, it's easy to understand how Jay Jay Okocha didn't really have any access to proper football pitches or even basic footballs at all. In an interview, Okocha said, "As far as I can remember, we used to play with anything, literally any round thing we could find. And whenever we managed to get hold of a ball, it was a bonus. I mean, it was amazing." He would play in the streets his entire childhood, honing his touch and skills with anything that would even remotely resemble a ball. But perhaps it was this incredibly tough childhood that would help him greatly improve his control at an earlier age. Eventually, he would find an outlet and an opportunity to play official football in a real pitch with underdeveloped but correct infrastructure when he joined a local Nigerian club, Enugu Rangers, at the age of 13. And with his very limited time in the club, he managed to score a goal against the best goalkeeper in his country at the time, the soon-to-be Nigerian national team goalkeeper, Willie Okpara, by no other than dribbling around him and casually tapping the ball into the back of the net. But despite the limited access to proper football, it was clear that Okocha was more talented than his peers in Nigeria, and good enough to make it to youth teams and bigger clubs in Europe. But the unfortunate truth is that there just weren't many opportunities in his home country of Nigeria. But everything would change when Okocha would fly out to Germany on vacation to meet a friend who was playing for 3rd Division club Borussia Neunkirchen. And as the story goes, he would follow his friend to training, where he would ask Okocha to join in and try playing with them. But JJ would completely surprise everyone, as he would outplay even the best in the squad, and look so impressive that the club's coaching staff couldn't believe what they were seeing. They heard he was good, but they couldn't imagine just how elite Okocha was. And without hesitation, they would invite him back the very next day and offer him a contract. And just like that, Jay Jay Okocha had finally had a chance at professional football. And after a couple seasons in the German 3rd tier league, it was just so clear that his talents belonged at a much higher and competitive level. So Frankfurt decided to basically steal Okocha away and finally put him where he belonged, playing in the top flight of the Bundesliga. And while many today might meme Bundesliga for being a farmers league, back then it certainly wasn't. Germany were the reigning world champions, and almost all of Germany's elite players were in their home league. But despite the high level of play, Okocha would immediately shine, getting a ton of attention after scoring one of his very first goals for the club by dribbling through the penalty area with incredible skill, absolutely toying with defenders, and to end it all off by dancing and making an absolute mockery of one of the most intimidating goalkeepers ever, Oliver Kahn, before he would go on to score one of the most iconic goals of all time. Many considered it to be the goal of the year, and it perfectly embodied Okocha's unique and flashy playing style. Even after 2 decades, when talking about Okocha, Oliver Kahn would still joke around, saying that till this day he still feels dizzy from that goal. Now, context is important, and you have to keep in mind that at the time, the world wasn't really aware of any Ronaldinhos or Neymars, who now are well known for their flashy skill and entertaining dribbling. Because before them was Jay Jay Okocha, and people had never really seen anything like him before. Of course, Maradona and Pelé were insanely skilled, but Okocha was just different in the way he dribbled, not only with efficiency, but with never-before-seen flair and showmanship. Some people might look at his highlights today and call him the African Ronaldinho, but the older generation will tell you, Ronaldinho was the Brazilian Jay Jay Okocha. Over time, he would solidify himself in the midfield, playing more of an attacking role. But his dribbling and flashiness wasn't the only thing he was known for. Okocha was a great distributor and playmaker as well, and in 1994, he would be the catalyst in the Nigerian national team. The people of Nigeria and Africa as a whole saw him as a hero, especially for doing the things he was doing in Bundesliga. But what he would do for his country would solidify him as a living legend. Firstly, he would come out clutch in World Cup qualifiers, helping his country of Nigeria qualify for their first ever World Cup. Then, a few months later, lead his country to the 1994 African Cup of Nations, inspiring countless young kids and even some up-and-coming players to try and do these crazy moves he was doing on the pitch. Okocha would then move on to play for Fenerbahce, which would, statistically speaking, be the best years of his career. Okocha would go on to have an impressive 34 goals and provide 19 assists in 60 appearances, a .82 goal contributions per game. This was when people would actually see more of Okocha's game other than just his dribbling, as most of his goals would actually come from set pieces, in which he would become an excellent free kick taker over the course of his career. Just another trademark of his otherworldly skill. And it was around these years that Okocha's stock value was at its absolute peak. That was when, in 1998, Okocha would make the move to French giants PSG. It may not seem like much for one of the wealthiest clubs in the world, but his transfer fee of 14 million euros back then made him the most expensive African player on the planet, and just a few million short of being the most expensive transfer in the world. And boy, would Okocha put on an absolute show in Paris. On a nightly basis, he would go on to display his full arsenal of skills and tricks, at times even making you wonder if he ever dribbled himself into a corner just so he could show off some insane skill or fancy move to get out of it. And it was in PSG where the young and up-and-coming Ronaldinho would play alongside Jay Jay Okocha. And when he first arrived, Okocha would look back saying, "When Ronaldinho arrived in Europe as a 20-year-old, he struggled to adapt early on with the food, culture, a new city, and a new country. It really reminded me of my first time in Europe too. I took my time to guide him, but he was already very talented, and the rest is history. He was still young before I left for England and he joined Barcelona. But Ronaldinho tried to imitate some of my skills and dribbles. And despite only one full season together, the two would still put on an absolute show." And Ronaldinho has never been shy to talk about Jay Jay Okocha, admitting on multiple occasions that he always admired Okocha and looked up to him, even going on to publicly pay his respects, saying that Jay Jay Okocha and Carlos Valderrama were the only number 10s he's ever admired. Ronaldinho would even go on record saying, "At training, we would watch him doing a freestyle, and whatever he wanted to do, the ball would do it." But despite their short year together in which they won the UEFA Intertoto Cup in 2001, Okocha would move on to play in the Premier League for Bolton, which funnily enough can arguably be the most well-remembered part of his career. But Ronaldinho would always be critical of his mentor's decisions, also going on to say, "His problem was that he was too keen to move to England. I didn't like the decision. At least in Italy or Spain, they allow you to play your skilled football without interfering with your play." But despite there being some truth in what Ronaldinho said, regardless, the Premier League had never seen a player like Jay Jay Okocha before. He would instantly become a club favorite and one of the most popular players in the entire league. Bolton fans would coin the iconic saying that went on like this: "JJ, so good they named him twice." And despite him getting older in the last few years of his career, Okocha would once more put on a show for the entirety of Africa. As in the 2004 African Cup of Nations, although Nigeria would finish in third place, Okocha would put on an absolute masterclass, being named the player of the tournament and being the joint top scorer with 4 goals. Truly an unforgettable performance to cement his legacy in the African continent. And although he would never really win much with Bolton, he would save them from relegation a number of times. And regardless of the lack of silverware, just being able to watch him play was an absolute pleasure. And after 4 years with Bolton and a single season with Hull City in the championship, the legendary career of Jay Jay Okocha would come to an end. Despite never winning a single piece of major silverware for any of his clubs, Okocha would play in a way that no one else before him really did. The world would watch his skills that he displayed on the pitch with pure amazement, and he would go on to inspire countless of players. His legacy in the game, marked by joyful and entertaining football, is something that deserves to be celebrated and respected. And make no doubt about it, the streets will never, ever, ever forget him.